When you were growing up, were you given warnings to keep you safe? Maybe your rebellious side wanted to go against those warnings. This is a story about a family living on a farm that used warnings to protect against a generational entity that terrorizes their land, livestock, and people. So stay tuned for this gruesome affair. Don't stray. Finding yourself in the talons of an owl and the shadows of the forest moonlight, it's a gruesome affair. It's always weird to return to a place you haven't been to in years. But there's a particular strangeness when, as an adult, you return to your old haunts from childhood. At first, you're on the lookout for those little things you remember, like the initials you carved into your bed frame out of boredom, or the dew stains you couldn't get out of the carpet. Then you notice things that never caught your eye before, like how peeled the wallpaper is and how the paint on the windowsill is mostly chipped away. And everywhere you look, you get this impossible feeling where you can swear the whole place shrunk in the wash. If you couldn't tell, I'm being specific for a reason. Right now, I'm in the old bedroom I shared with my little brother on the farm I'd last seen in the dusty rearview mirror of my father's pickup, a place I hadn't seen in person since then, but have visited countless times in dreams and nightmares past. It's surreal to look out this window and see bare land where countless corn stalks blanketed the view so far out. Maybe there wasn't ever that many. Or maybe I don't remember it right. It's funny how a single incident can be relived so much over the years that it warps, mutating from what it actually was to its worst possible version. And I remember it. God, do I remember it. I'm running through what feels like a never-ending field, barely able to see past the corn stalks I'm pushing through, desperately searching for sanctuary in vain as the great shadow begins to wash over me. I remember what happened next, but whenever I go through it again, I wake up from it just as the shadows reach me, as the skin over my shoulder is torn open, the hooks piercing into me as the blood flows out. The world falls out from under me, all sinking away, and I fly up into the waking world, accompanied every time by a coat of sweat all over and a piercing phantom pain in my shoulder. I left this place not long after that, after the attack. I know what really happened that day, the first time I lived through it, but that's not the whole story. It's not the beginning, and as I've sworn to myself and others already, it's not the end either. This farm is where I was raised. My great-grandfather built it up from nothing, and for 3 generations, the Clary family raised livestock and grew corn in this valley. Since then, the Clarys have lived and died on this farm for 4 generations, and as my father made very clear, my brother and I were expected to live the same lives. "Everything's a circle," he said. "It's just the way life is for us." I wasn't against the idea. Some places are so quiet and peaceful that there's no need to romanticize it. And if you've been anywhere in rural Montana, you know what I mean. Mountains in all directions, the big blue sky overhead, wildlife at your doorstep. It's an incredible place. My family was pretty sheltered, and I rarely left the farm, but I was always happy to see the world from a distance, appreciating what I had with no drive to see what else was out there. My little brother, Henry, wasn't so content as I was. He looked out our bedroom window and didn't see beauty. He saw adventure. My parents tried to stomp that out of him, and for a long time, I didn't know why. I just thought that my mother was overprotective, telling us both to stay inside the house unless we were helping our father with his work, and not to stray if we were out there. If my brother protested or if he was caught wandering off, she would tell him stories of other kids from the area who strayed too far from home and were never seen again. He never believed her, brushing her warnings off as cautionary tales. We were homeschooled, so most of the time we listened to our mother, but there was just something in Henry's head that stopped him from taking those stories in. These warnings got more frequent and more serious after some of our animals started dying. I was 11 or 12 at the time, so Henry would have been no older than 10. I didn't make the connection between the warnings and the dead livestock at first, but then I saw why we were so often told not to stray. One afternoon, my father stomped into the kitchen and told my mother that one of the horses was gone. I didn't know what he meant by gone until he told me to hop in the truck and help him and his farmhands move the body. We drove into the field we let the horses roam in after the rest were brought into the stable, of course, and stopped by what at first looked like a horse just lying on its side. "Now, before we do this, Donnie," my father warned, "it's not pretty, so just brace yourself." "Yeah, it's pretty bad, kid," one of the farmhands added. When we got out of the truck, I saw what they meant. The skin of the horse's shoulders was shredded, torn apart by what looked like some wild beast's claws. The mane was caked with blood, and above it, the entire head was gone. We pulled the heavy body up to the wood ramp we'd leaned against the flatbed, and after a lot of sweating and swearing, got it secured. My father was staring off into the distance to the woods west of the farm. "Plenty of daylight, right?" I asked. I only realized now that he wasn't looking to see how far down the sun was like I'd originally assumed. The sun sets the other way. He was looking out for something else. "Sure," he muttered. "Get in the truck, Donnie. I'll bring you home before we dump this." "I can help," I protested. "I want to help." "That's enough for today," he said. "Do what I tell you." When he dropped me off at home, my father went to his den before returning to the truck. When he came through the kitchen to leave, he had his hunting rifle slung over his shoulder and his double-barrel shotgun broken open, balanced over one forearm while he loaded slugs into the barrel. "I'll be back in a few, honey," he told my mother, who stared at the weapons with grim discomfort. "Be back soon," she made him promise. "I will." That was one of the first of our livestock to be killed, but it wouldn't be the last. And it wasn't just our farm being used as a beast's hunting ground. Whenever my father would go into town, he'd come back with stories of neighbors dealing with the same issues. Every time I looked outside after that horse was killed, my father and the farmhands were armed. That didn't stop the killings. My father rarely asked us to help unless the animal was too heavy for him and his farmhands to handle alone. But it was rare that so much of the carcass was intact. As one of the farmhands phrased it, "Sometimes the head's missing, sometimes that's all we find. They take a piece or they leave pieces. I guess it depends on how hungry they are." I asked what he thought was responsible for the attacks, but he just shrugged. One of our temporary fences was broken up one morning after a horse got spooked and ran right through it. And in the effort to round them up, one of the foals ran off and made its way to the far end of the larger fenced-in area. By the time my father found it, it was dead. When he came inside to tell my mother about it, Henry offered to help him move it into the truck, something he hated having to do, in the hopes that he could convince our father to let him tag along when the body was dumped. After the attacks had started, my father was less willing to bring us into town with him, so Henry was getting stir-crazy being cooped up in the house all day. My father accepted his offer. The foal was too heavy for the two of them, so I was brought along to help. When we set the foal down, I saw the blood start to pool up around the neck and dry heaved at the sight. I kept looking back at the foal as we started down the dirt path from our farm, a path that divided the halves of our cornfield to the road that led to town, and slowly watched as the pool of blood began to form at the end of its neck. Since the horse I helped load in, my father had clearly not bothered with the farmhand's advice about putting down a tarp. There were circular red stains all over the bed of the pickup. During the drive to what my father called the dumping ground, Henry asked about the process. "I thought people turned dead horses into glue. Why don't we make use of it like that, or at least use the meat?" "No, tainted meat," my father replied with a finality that Henry didn't challenge. We drove along the road for a while. Henry was enjoying the window seat, holding his arm out to catch the wind. I felt a creeping unease as we kept going. The forest's tree line inching closer to the roadside the farther we got. My father slowed down as we neared a tree with a yellow marker nailed to it. "Almost there," he muttered, easing the car off the road towards a gap in the trees. The gap felt unnatural, and as we made our way into the forest, we passed discarded stumps. "Dad, who made this path?" I asked. "My grandfather," he answered. "Back when this first happened, they needed a place to put these animals, far out of the way of everything else." "But why would they?" "No more questions," he snapped. "We're here." The man-made path had led to a natural clearing, which would have been a beautiful place before it became a dumping ground. If you've ever been to a dump, you've seen how it almost looks like organized waste. The spaces between piles of trash becoming walkways, the larger piles forming hills you could step on like they're solid ground. The newer waste on top is intact enough to make out old furniture and the like, but the older stuff just looks blended together like they've fused over the years and become one gray mass. I can't think of another way to compare what I saw. Most of the clearing was taken up by a dirty white heap of bone, but around the edges of the clearing, the newer discarded carcasses were all on their way to joining the rest in their final state. The rotting animals were far more than I expected to see, and I realized that this wasn't just the Clary dumping ground. All of the nearby farms, as my father had mentioned, were dealing with this problem. Judging by how many bones were there, it had been a problem for a long time. Henry must have come to the same conclusion. He whistled at the sight. "Everything's a circle, right?" I couldn't look away, not on my own, before the sight could burn deeply into me. My father snapped me out of it by telling us to get out of the truck and help him move the foal. We made quick work of it. Henry's general excitement temporarily reeled in by the view of the dumping ground. We left the foal at the edge of the nearest pile and made our way home in silence. Henry rolled up his window and stared at the dashboard, for once, not at the path ahead. When we got home, my father told us to wait a moment before going inside. "You both know how I could have gotten one of my workers to do this with me, but you needed to see that, just like I did when I was a boy. When we tell you not to stray, we mean it, and you know why. It's dangerous out there. Always has been." I had a million questions. The first one being, what kind of animal could do so much damage, and why hadn't it been hunted down by the community yet? But I stayed silent. Henry spoke up. "Dad, those were just animal bones, right?" My father looked west, toward the woods, and sniffed. "Get going, quickly now." We went inside and spent the rest of the afternoon on our own, not saying a word about the clearing to our mother. Something must have clicked in Henry after that, because the next day he started towing the line between following the rules and wandering outside. You could swear he was trying to get on our mother's good side, but he did everything she told him to do. including stay inside. I thought for a while that Henry had grown out of a phase. One night, however, Henry shook me awake, and I saw that he was dressed and the window was open. He wanted to go explore an old abandoned farmstead he'd spotted off the road when we'd last driven to town. I reminded him of the clearing, our mother's stories, and he laughed it all off. "Come on, Donnie," he whispered. "Those are just tall tales. Look, if you're so worried that we'll find a house made of candy, we'll just bring a loaf of bread with us." "I'm not going out there in the middle of the night," I protested. "It's late, and we've got chores tomorrow." "Coward," Henry grumbled, making his way to the window. "Idiot," I replied, turning away in my bunk. I heard him climb through the window, then silence for a moment. "Hey, don't tell Mom I did this." "I'll tell her if you don't close the window," I threatened. The window was quietly pushed shut. I didn't look back, but I heard Henry crawl down the side of the house, lightly land on the ground, and quietly jog away towards the adventure he craved so much. And that's the last I saw or heard from him. When I woke up the next morning, he was still gone. I got worried and immediately went downstairs, asking my mother where Henry was, knowing it'd set off alarms in her head. When she realized he was missing, I decided to dummy up and pretend I didn't know he'd snuck out in the first place. I knew that they'd find him and that he would keep shut about knowing that I saw him sneak out because I didn't stop him from leaving in the first place. But that didn't happen. When my father asked where he might have gone, I offered that he mention the abandoned farmstead nearby, but didn't let on that I knew he'd gone that way. I asked if he wanted me to go along, and he tensed up, the color draining from his face. He just shook his head, but I got the idea. If Henry got attacked by the animal that had been killing our livestock, we would find him, but we wouldn't find all of him. My father went looking for Henry, and when his truck came back that afternoon, he parked near the barn instead of by the house. For a while, I watched him just sitting there, resting his head on the wheel, and I knew that Henry was gone. When my father finally got the nerve to come inside, my mother and I were at the kitchen table. She was still begging God for her son's safe return, but my father wasn't wearing his jacket, and his hands had dried blood on them, so I knew it was too late for his help. "Go upstairs, Donnie," he commanded, and I did. From the top of the stairs, I heard them quietly discussing it. Bits of conversation flowed up, mostly heated moments that they couldn't keep a whisper. "Tracks just ended there. Blood. A shoe. His shoe. Can't know that it's our boy. Can't know that it was him, honey. Wasn't all there, right? Fucking arm, Judith. I know what our son's arm looks like. Do you hear me? Today, right now. You better promise. Today, right now. You better promise. Today, right now. You better promise. Drowning in waves of nausea, I retreated to the bathroom, kneeling over the toilet bowl. A few minutes later, I heard the truck start. Looking out the window, I saw that my father's bloody jacket and a shovel were in the truck bed. When he returned just before sundown, the shovel was still there, but the jacket and whatever it may have been wrapped around was gone. In the months afterwards, my parents never sat me down and talked to me about Henry, about what happened. We all knew that he was gone, and I knew not to ask questions about it. The more I thought about the bloody jacket, the more likely I was to throw up. I tried not to think about the void he left behind at first, but eventually I made my peace with the fact that I was an only child now. It was strange, having a room to myself and no one my age to talk to. I didn't used to think about how sheltered I was until after that. When he left and never came back, An unspoken decision had been made about his things, that they had all gone to me. Maybe I'd inherited his sense of restlessness, because my world felt very small. For a few weeks, I tried to not touch any of Henry's things, and my justification was that he never liked when I messed with his property without permission. One evening, after a silent dinner, I felt compelled to take inventory of what Henry left behind. His clothes, the comic books he begged our father to buy him whenever he brought us into town with him, a few toys, a lot of books, mostly untouched with the exception of a well-worn copy of Treasure Island, and his shoes. Despite being a bigger brother, I was always a bit smaller than Henry. I took the shoes, knowing that I'd grow into them, and stuffed everything else in the closet. I was surprised to find that my mother wasn't more focused than ever on keeping me safe. On the contrary, I felt the proverbial leash I always had at home started to give more slack. She gave me reading assignments but didn't homeschool me so directly as before. When that summer following Henry's loss passed by, we stopped the homeschooling, and when fall rolled around, we didn't pick it back up. She seemed more interested in spending her free time shuffling around the house in her bathrobe or sleeping in her bed, and she never wanted to be disturbed. Henry was gone, but my mother was the ghost that haunted the house. My father buried himself in his work, and when there was nothing to do, he'd find things that needed fixing. One evening, when I saw him adjusting a painting on the wall that I could swear was straight when I'd last passed it, I made a joke about him fixing Mom because of how she's acting. He sent me to my room for the rest of the night for that. No dinner. I deserved it. The killings didn't stop, but we stopped talking about it. One summer afternoon, my father brought me along to help dump a cow leg that he'd found that morning. As we cruised down the road, I rolled the window down and held my arm out to catch the wind. The wound of Henry's loss wasn't so fresh anymore, and it was easier to think of him. By then, he'd been gone for over a year. We tossed the cow leg into the pile, which I hadn't seen in quite a while. By the looks of it, the killings had become far less frequent. The older carcasses we'd left before had long rotted away, their skeletons all that remained. Before I could get back into the truck, my father stopped me. "Donnie, it's time I showed you something." I had a feeling it was coming. He didn't need any help moving that cow leg. "Follow me," he said. We walked straight through the clearing, past piles and between heaps. I stared at my feet, both out of disgust and to make sure I didn't trip over anything. Through the other side, past the old bones, the clearing opened up. I wondered where we were going until I saw a dirt mound near the tree line, its place marked with a small pile of rocks. I didn't have to ask whose grave it was. I looked at my father and knew that he was silently praying, the only kind of praying he ever did. I followed suit. After what could have been a few minutes or a few hours, my father sighed and told me that it was time to go. I looked down at the small pile of rocks and couldn't help but feel offended that this was where my brother's remains were laid to rest. He deserved a real grave, or at least a proper grave marker. I walked to the bone piles and a few minutes later returned with a long spine and what I could only guess was a leg bone. My father didn't ask what I was doing and watched as I kicked off my shoes, sat next to my brother's grave, and pulled my shoelaces out. At first, I tried in vain to tie the bones together by myself. After he realized what I was doing, my father sat beside me and helped me properly knot them in place. We used our hands to dig a fingers-deep hole just past the stone pile and placed the cross together. When we stood up, I put my shoes back on. The cross was almost knee height. I looked down at my laceless shoes, originally Henry's. I didn't stop him from leaving that night, more concerned with being a good brother than a good son. He didn't listen to our parents' warnings, but I did, and I disregarded them in an even more irresponsible way. It was my mistake, but in these things you don't have second chances, just regrets. Regrets and the opportunity to pay your respects. My little world kept turning and we kept moving forward. The fields kept expanding. My mother stopped hiding in her room so much, and I eventually grew out of Henry's shoes. In those quiet years, the killings died down so much that we didn't keep constant watch on the livestock. I started asking my father about leaving the farm so I could get a real education, and even came to the conclusion that I could move in with my aunt in Billings if she would let me. I was 14, and I wanted to see more of the world while I still had the freedom from responsibility that youth allows. He didn't like the idea, but didn't completely shut me down. It was always a conversation for tomorrow. One morning in early September, my father was busy with prep work for the impending corn harvest. Usually he went out to check the mail, but he asked me to do it instead. I'd made a habit of wandering around the farm and stretching my legs, so I was happy for the excuse to walk so close to the edge of the property. It was a beautiful day. The sky was clear and empty, the sun bright, but not too hot. Summer was leaving fast, and fall couldn't wait to take over. I took my time walking down the road, watching the cornstalks sway in the light breeze into a haze of comfort. In other words, I'd let my guard down. As I reached the mailbox, an unsettling feeling began to wash over me. The feeling of being watched. I looked behind me, saw nothing, and looked out towards the empty field on the other side of the road. Again, nothing. I stepped out a bit, looking first down the left side of the road, then the right, just past the mailbox. Beside the road leading into town was a large black shape. It wasn't just a shape, it had some sort of depth to it, but I couldn't really tell what I was looking at, and the sun was rising from its direction, so it wasn't well lit. It wasn't so tall as the cornstalks, but it was large, and the mass of blackness looked almost like it was moving. It was quivering, but not in fear, in anticipation. A strained, forced sound started to come from the dark form. "Hello? Are you a child?" I took a step back, and the darkness expanded. Giant black wings stretched far in both directions, casting a great shadow before me. With the wings at its sides, I could see the creature itself. The beast had long, thin limbs, all covered in the same night black feathers, with long, scaled hands and feet, each with 3 digits and 3 talons. The beast's head jutted forward from its torso, without a neck between them. The eyes were a dull and lifeless void. It didn't have a beak, just a long, lipless opening. The edges of it were lined with ridges that reminded me of a bear trap. From that terrifying maw, a thin tongue began to protrude, dripping with saliva. I shivered uncontrollably, unable to accept that what I was looking at was real. "Precious child," it asked, and I began to run. A thick coughing sound followed, which at the time confused me. In the weeks after, I came to the conclusion that it must have been laughter. It didn't chase me, not on foot, but I heard a large gust of air so powerful that the nearby cornstalks bent further in my direction. I started running along the cornfield, risking the straight path that would more quickly get me to the house. I didn't scream, but only out of fear that it would hear me. That didn't matter. The beast knew exactly where I was, and I watched in vain as the shadow, its great wings cast, began to stretch over me. More of the coughing laughter and the fear pushed me to keep running from it. As the shadow grew, the creature swooping down towards me, I ducked to the left and ran into the cornfield, then turned right and made for the farm. I could barely see past the stalks I pushed through, straining to see as much as I could in desperate search for sanctuary. The shadows stretched over me again, and the creature dipped, swiping a great clawed hand at my back. I could feel it tugging at my shirt, but it didn't have me in its grip. I started ducking and weaving from left to right, trying to stay out of its reach, but the creature was patient. Just as I stood up from a duck, it struck, its talons digging into my shoulder. The skin was torn open and the blood began to flow over the right side of my body. I screamed out and it laughed again. I tried to keep moving, but it was far too strong. The grip tightened as the beast began to beat its wings, preparing to fly away with me. The world fell out from under me, sinking away as I was raised higher into the air, my feet rising past the tips of the corn stalks. I screamed again, wriggling as much as I could, and the grip loosened for a moment. Out of desperation, I pulled at its scaled fingers and fell out of its grip, the talons tearing more of my shoulder open as I fell. The fall was more graceful than it could have been. The momentum threw me forward, and I spun in the air. I landed on my back, the corn stalks somewhat padding the impact. Rolling forward, my beaten body settled on the dirt, and I almost passed out from the intense pain. My entire body was aching, and stabbing pains kept pulsing in my shoulder, like the talons were tearing into me again and again. I couldn't muster up any strength. The energy was drained out of me. I felt the blood pool around my shoulder, and the stained bed of my father's pickup came to mind. I could feel myself drifting out of myself, upwards, my soul straying from its still-living husk it was leaving behind. The shadow of the beast passed over me. I turned over, pulling myself to my feet with my left hand. As much as I missed Henry, this monster wouldn't be allowed to reunite us anytime soon. I burst through the stalks, all force and no direction. I knew the monster would kill me, but I wasn't going to let it happen. The shadow continued to pass overhead, first in quick bursts, then lingering glides, until it blocked the sun from touching my skin entirely. I can still feel the chill of its shadow, taste the desperate sweat on the corner of my mouth. I wondered what it would leave behind if there would be enough of me left that I could be buried by Henry. Would my father tie bones together for a marker? Would he use shoelaces to bind them? As I could feel the talons of the beast inching closer, I started to grow weaker. Was it the blood loss, or was I giving in, as prey so often do when they lose hope, choosing the cleaner death? And suddenly I was back on the ground. The pain of hitting something shoulder first had blinded the senses, but as I stared up, the blurred form that stopped me had started to take shape. Risen above the cornstalks, a man stood with his arms raised and held out. An invitation? A threat? I couldn't tell. The creature screamed, a throaty groan that made me flinch. The shadow passed over me, circling the area before it screamed again and flew off towards the forest. My vision cleared a bit, and in the haze of pain and confusion, I realized that I had run into a scarecrow. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't have the energy. I wanted to cry out, but I was already fading away. I woke up in an unfamiliar bed weeks later. Eventually, one of the farmhands visited me in the hospital and told me what happened. He'd seen the great beast flying near the edge of the cornfield and ran towards the scarecrow when he saw that it had warded the creature off. The way he tells it, when he picked me up, I was stone cold. He thought he was carrying my corpse. Thank God he wasn't. The first person I talked to was my doctor. The corn harvest wouldn't wait for me, so my parents were busy dealing with that, but I was assured that they visited often. When they visited me the first time, I tried to tell them about the monster, but they wouldn't talk about it. When I shared the detail about the scarecrow, my father stared out the window intently, lost in thought. I could see the gears turning in his head. This was new information to him. At first, I tried to talk to the doctors and the nurses about the monster, but quickly came to the understanding that it wasn't a secret to them. The few that would listen always told me that it wasn't something I should talk about. One afternoon, an old janitor came in and asked me how I was. I told him that it would be easier if people didn't act like it never happened. He pulled up a shirt sleeve and showed me a set of 3 scars, 2 wrapping around one side of his forearm, the third wrapping around the other. It's not often that someone crosses paths with the bird and lives to talk about it. I'm not going to say you're lucky, but you're not dead, so... He left the rest unsaid, nodded, and left. The recovery was rough. My scars are gruesome enough, but my right arm's never been the same since. My handwriting was never anything special, but I've had to learn how to write left-handed. While I was still in the hospital, my parents agreed that, when I was well again, I should live with my aunt in Billings. The hospital stay was longer than any of us expected, and they wanted to keep me there for longer while I started physical therapy on my arm. I didn't move back into my old room. We all thought it would be an easier transition if I only came back to the farm to gather my things. The day of the move, my father picked me up from the hospital and brought me home. My clothes were already packed, so I went to my room and took one final look around, wondering what I would miss if I left it behind. Nothing seemed important until I started digging through the closet. As it turned out, I didn't need a second bag. I came back down the stairs with nothing in hand, just a well-worn copy of Treasure Island in my back pocket. As we started down the road which would take us through town before reaching the highway that would bring us to Billings, I rolled my window down. I tried to raise my right arm so I could catch the wind, but it didn't have the strength, so I pulled it up with my left hand. We passed the entrance to the clearing. I looked down the man-made path, saying a silent goodbye to Henry on the way. Before the edge of the forest began to pull away from the road, a great shadow passed over the truck. My father didn't speed up, but he held the wheel with one hand and rested the shotgun on his lap with the other. I pulled my arm back in and rolled the window up. I didn't see the beast again, but after we made it to my aunt's house, we found a large black feather in the truck bed. A farewell present from the monster. When I picked it up, I could hear it laughing. I threw it to the ground and tried to forget about it. The years since have been much kinder to me. I fell into a new life and an entire world to explore, and no fears of great and terrible beasts hunting me down. That didn't make sleeping any easier, but the days were good. I've tried for the last 20 years to move on in an aftermath of the attack. The thrill of adventure, Henry's inheritance, eventually gave way to my own passion teaching. I make a habit of being overprotective, often making a point to teach my students not to take dangerous risks, to not stray. Sometimes they actually listen, yet still I feel the shadow of the beast over me. Last week my mother called and asked me to return home. We've kept in touch, mostly handwritten letters, but I'd never returned to the farm. I knew she had a reason to ask that of me, but it wasn't good. My father's health was failing him, and he wanted to see his son one more time. Unfortunately, he stubbornly refused to spend his last days in the hospital, choosing to die in his grandfather's home. Everything's a circle after all. So I got my affairs in order, took a leave of absence at my school, and made my way back home. The trip was surreal. I spent a few hours in town with the intent of taking in the sights, but the fact that so little had changed became too depressing. I didn't take my time on the road to the Clary farm either. Part of me wanted to look out to the forest, to try to see if the yellow marker was still there, but I willed myself forward. My family was waiting for me, and I didn't want to think about what else would be waiting in the wings, pun intended. The land was bare, the cornstalks all gone, everything but the farmhouse in disrepair. The scarecrow was still in the field, but it wasn't alone. There must have been over 50 scarecrows on the Clary farm, all standing silently, warding off a beast that had nothing left to hunt. When I left, my father had toiled away for another decade or so before deciding to retire. Without a willing son to take over, he didn't see the point in it anymore. I parked my car next to his old pickup and was greeted at the front door by my mother. She had visited me in Billings, or the city as she calls it, but being back home with her was different, like we'd never seen each other since I left the farm behind. After she helped me get settled in, insisted on taking my suitcase to the guest room and unpacking everything in the dresser, she brought me to my bedridden father. My father had always embodied strength and willpower to me. When Henry died, he only worked harder, and while one could brush that off as a coping mechanism, I knew it was in his nature to keep working despite all. Now, a sickly old man who couldn't stand on his own, the man before me was a ghost, a shadow of who he was, with nothing keeping him there but unfinished business and the will to stay put. "A moment alone, dear," he asked my mother, barely more than a whisper. She left us, closing the door behind her. "The beast," he said the moment the door was shut, cutting straight to the point. I sat down, rested my hands on his. "It doesn't matter, Dad, I'm here." He sat up, putting real effort into it. No, he said, shaking his head, the strength returning to his voice. "She wouldn't have told you. It's back." I wasn't used to feeling so helpless, not while awake anyway, but those words made me want to run back to Billings without saying a proper farewell. No, how do you know?" "Phone," he grumbled. And I went back to the dumping ground. Not all bones. New dead. New graves. He laid back down again, sweating. "New dead? New graves? If this is true, then why would you call me back home?" I asked selfishly, terrified. He closed his eyes. "Your grandfather wandered off one day, strayed from the road, found a nest. Strange eggs, big eggs." He strained to continue. "Don't push yourself, Dad," I warned. "No," he protested. "You need to know. The beast. It wasn't the only one." The fear built up at that, tears stinging my eyes. "More than one? Oh God." My father nodded, not bothering to hide his own fear. "He disturbed the eggs, dropped a few, ran away. Then they started attacking us, taking our livestock at first. Then some kids. Your great-grandfather and the rest of them fought back, found them in the woods, killed most of them, piled the bodies in the clearing." "Most of them? Christ, how many are left?" I couldn't stop shaking, but a grim fascination with the tale kept pulling these questions out of me. "There's always been one more that keeps coming back. My father had a theory. He thought that the only one to stay alive was the one whose eggs he broke." "To get at us? Are we marked or something? I don't understand." My father started weeping, holding his eyes closed as if to will the tears to stop flowing.
We tried to keep you both safe, but I knew. This monster, I knew it wouldn't leave. It took my sister, my brothers, everyone but me. This place is cursed. We cursed it.
Dad, listen to me. I held his hand in mine, and he looked up, for once looking to me for strength. Henry died because I let him sneak out. That's my fault. I spilled that blood, not you. You hear me? I killed him. He shook his head, and I felt his hand ball up into a fist.
No. We should have moved. I was stubborn. I thought I could keep you safe.
No, I screamed. No, you provided for us. It was my job to watch out for him. He was my little brother, and I failed him, and then I ran away.
We're all guilty, he croaked. I've made my peace with my burden. You promise me. Promise me you'll make peace with yours.
Yeah, Dad, I will, I promise. I felt the strength leave his fist, saw the fatigue wash over him. When I knew he was sleeping, I left the room, saying a silent goodbye to him. He was dead the next morning, passed on in his sleep. I could feel it coming, but I wasn't ready for it. We had the funeral 2 days ago, gave him a proper burial and everything. He was laid to rest next to his siblings, who had long been waiting for him. There were a lot of Clary graves, but I could only think of the other one, the resting place I had seen only the once, a long time ago. On the way home, I slowed down when the tree line crept up to the road and looked out for the gap in the trees. The marker was gone, but I found the path. As my father had mentioned, the clearing had some new additions. I couldn't bear to take a closer look, so I walked around them and through the gap in the mounds of bone. Henry's grave was intact, the cross still holding in place. I could see that the binding had been supported by duct tape. My father must have done that during his last visit to the clearing. Nearby, newer graves dotted the forest's edge, some with homemade signs, others with bone crosses similar to the one I made for Henry. I got down on my knees and started to pray. I prayed for my father to be in a good place, for his mistakes to be forgotten and his virtues to be remembered. I prayed that his siblings would be waiting for him, that they would be at peace. When I opened my eyes, I understood why my father had brought me back. It wasn't to see me one more time, and it wasn't to pass on the story of the beast. He gave me a grim inheritance, the burden of responsibility. Without it, he was able to float off into the heavens, and now it was my cross to bear. The idea of inheritance reminded me of what I came to the clearing for. I got to my feet and finished through my coat pockets until I found the book, Henry's copy of Treasure Island. I set it against the cross. I know you're probably still mad at me, and I deserve it, but I'll make it right. In the meantime, don't stray. Dad's on the way, and if he's not already there, tell him I understand. Tell him I'll get it done, or I'll see you both soon. As I turned to leave, the shadow passed over. The dread locked me in place, and I only saw the beast for a moment as it flew over the treetops out of view. In the last couple of days since I saw the beast, I've been preparing. It's waiting for me, and now I know where I can find it. I've practiced with my father's guns, and while I'm not a great shot, there's a few brutalized scarecrows that could tell you I'm not exactly terrible. I've said my goodbyes to my mother and collected what I need. Tomorrow morning, I'll be heading for the clearing one last time in my father's pickup with no expectations of coming back home. After 4 generations, I can feel the circle reaching its final loop. There's no more Clarys to hunt, and only one more monster to kill. I can't promise you that it'll go my way, and I can't promise you that the beast will finally be reunited with its own kind. All I can promise you is blood.
All I can promise you is blood. All I can promise you
Smoking Owl here. I really enjoy these horrible stories and hope that you do too. If so, please rip at the like button and scratch a comment. And best of all, help me on the path to 100 subscribers by subscribing now. And catch you on another night very soon.